Nowhere was this chaos more clearly etched upon Russia's countenance than in Petrograd, where shortages of food, fuel, goods, and public services threatened to overwhelm the city. Never in Petrograd's 200-year history had life been worse for its people, nor as uncertain as the Bolsheviks' revolutionary egalitarianism erased all the traditional points of reference at once. Before the end of 1917, Russia's new government abolished church marriage and made divorce available on demand. Gold, silver, precious stones, large savings accounts, and certain factories all became state property, and so did large private homes, into which the Bolsheviks immediately began to move tens of thousands of former slum dwellers. Everything was being cancelled, Alexei Tolstoy wrote at the beginning of 1918. The second part of his Stalin prize-winning trilogy about the revolution and civil war. Rings, honors, pensions, officers' epaulets, the 13th letter of the alphabet, God, property, and even the right to live, as one wished, all were being cancelled. When he returned to Petrograd that winter, the young literary critic Viktor Shlovisky thought that the atmosphere in the city seemed like an explosion when it's all over, when everything's blown up. Some felt that the city of Peter the Great was dying. For others, life in the capital of New Russia took on a dullness that no amount of revolutionary fervor could unliven. Once the grand dam of the city's literary stallions, the poet Zenata Kipis was now declaring life in Bolshevik Petrograd to be boring above all else. What am I going to say at this moment is very strange, but it is boring for me to write. Yes, even among these loathsome and unprecedented horrors, it is boring. None who lived in Petrograd at the end of 1917 could doubt the speed at which the old Russia, the Russia of privilege, wealth, and grinding poverty, was breaking up. All that was real and all that was vital, the best and the worst of men, lay close to the surface. One American journalist recalled as she described the uncertainty of these turbulent times. Overnight, people of no experience or accomplishment rose to command, while men and women of rank and distinction fell into abject poverty. Revolutionary sailors turned the Stroganov's precious Baroque palace, with which Russia's greatest 18th century architect Rastrelli had adorned the corner of the Nevsky Prospect and the Mokai embankment, into an amusement center for their off-duty hours. They smoked their cigarettes and spit out their sunflower seeds beneath the Claude Laurens and the Poissons, the French diplomat Louis de Robin lamented. They want to make openings in the wonderful paneling in the ballroom and turn it into a cinema. Everywhere, men and women who had stood on the peaks of old Russia slipped to its lowest depths, as Petrograd's new masters insisted that those that once served now must serve. I saw an old general and a priest, the old Russia itself, clearing the streets of snow in order not to die of starvation. Our grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and fathers all had to clean up the shit and filth of your fathers and grandfathers, Trotsky explained at some point. Now you are going to do the same thing for us. Petrograd was awash with tales of lives broken and hopes lost. Officers, barristers, schoolmasters, and engineers got employment as house porters and as messengers, while others were breaking up the ice, selling newspapers, cigarettes, and chocolate. One sympathetic observer remembered. Rumor had it that the former colonel and the elite imperial guards had been begging for, for a bowl of soup from the head waiter who had served them in better times. Others found themselves in even more desperate straits, and more than a few formerly well-to-do wives and daughters turned to prostitution rather than to see their families starve. Perhaps nothing captured the sad spirit of the fallen in those days better than the watercolors of Ivan Vladmirov, one which portrayed a prince sitting on a crumbling stone in an overgrown courtyard. His ragged trousers still bore the broad red stripe of a Tsarist general, but the goat that stood tethered to his bony wrist spoke amply of the wretched plight of Russia's former lords, who faced poverty and physical danger at every turn. Violence, or the threat of it, seemed everywhere that winter, as mobs of armed soldiers roamed Petrograd's streets. Numbered at more than 100,000 at the beginning of 1917, the city's garrison had grown steadily as men joined it to defend the revolution. Soldiers clustered on street corners, barred to the crowds that clogged Petrograd's sidewalks, and forced their way into streetcars, from which people hung by any available handhold. There were always so many soldiers about in the streets of Petrograd that civilians were swallowed up by the grayish tidal wave. One woman remembered. Civilians hurried to hide themselves. They tried to run away, to get into the shadow. War had long since rendered life cheap. Now, too many gray-coated men with too many guns made violence a way of life. Soldiers and ex-soldiers killed for money, for such luxuries as furs and jewelry, for clothing and for food. Sometimes they killed for no reason at all. No more than 5 minutes walk from the American embassy, dear Robin saw two soldiers shoot an old woman rather than pay for the stunted green apples she offered for sale. When you recall that all this is going on in a country where human life is ridiculously cheap, where there is no respect for the individual and his work, and when you think that the simplicity of killing becomes a habit, an everyday occurrence, you grow fearful for Russia. Maxim Gorky wrote at the end of January. Himself, risen from their midst, Gorky feared the masses' dark, brooding violence, and explained the unspeakably foul acts of Petrograd's soldiers as a product of Russia's sad past. Dirovin viewed the situation more generously. These simple people who, for 4 years, have been allowed to kill and be rewarded for it with crosses and decorations, now do it automatically, he explained sadly. They know of no other rule than that of the rifle and bayonet. As murder became commonplace on Petrograd's streets, robbery grew rampant, leaving no person safe and no one's possessions immune. According to one estimate, almost 800 robberies occurred in Petrograd every day during January 1918, as the Russians stole from their government, their church, and each other with equal enthusiasm. One winter night, Petrograd's robbers even dragged Mosai Utursky from his sleigh, stole every stitch of his clothing, and left him to make his home away naked. He commanded the Petrograd Cheka, the Bolsheviks' newly established security police force, and they did not deter themselves in the slightest. As is well known, one of the loudest and most heartily welcome slogans for our peculiarly Russian Revolution has been the slogan, "Rob the robbers," Gorky wrote. No doubt history will tell of this process of Russia's self-robbery with the greatest inspiration, he added with bitter sarcasm. This is an original, and we can be proud. There was nothing similar, even in the era of the Great French Revolution. Hello, Miss Sarah. Nowhere did proletarians rob Petrograd's rich with more enthusiasm than in their assaults upon the wine cellars. During the October Revolution, there had been scattering instances in which Red Guards and groups of workers had broken into stores of wine and spirits. With the full force of the storm, the so-called wine riots broke only a month earlier, when Petrograd's workers invaded the cellars of the Winter Palace. And then, the cellars of the Grand Dukes, great lords, rich merchants, and some of the city's best shops and restaurants. To the Bolsheviks' dismay, their hand-picked guards joined the workers all too readily. The Guards regiment, assigned to guard these cellars, got totally drunk. One of Petrograd's senior Red commanders wrote, "We sent guards from various other hand-picked units. All got utterly drunk. We posted guards especially chosen from regimental committees. They succumbed as well. We dispatched armored cars to drive away the crowd. After patrolling up and down a few times, they also began to weave suspiciously. We tried sealing up the entrances with brick. The crowd came back through the windows, smashing the gratings and seizing what remained. We tried flooding the cellars with water. The firemen sent to do the job got drunk instead." Finally, a detachment of sailors, described as men of iron, more used to killing than drinking, ended the orgy by smashing the casks and bottles that remained unemptied in the cellars of Russia's former czars. "It is sickening to see such good stuff thrown away," de Robin lamented in his diary. "There were bottles of Tokay there from the time of Catherine the Great." Bottles containing some of Chateau, Motan, the Rothschild's greatest vintages, perished in the mob assault against Grand Duke Pavel Alexandrovich's palace at nearby Sarko Selo. Constant's elegant restaurant, the favorite of those diplomats who still remained in the city, only kept its wine cellars intact by hiring special detachments of machine gun carrying guards. It was as if guerrilla warfare was going on right in the front of the entrance to the kingdom of the Balkans, one observer remarked. Trotsky called for the sternest measures to bring Petrograd under control. "If you do not succeed in barring the path to drunken excess, all of you will have left in the way of defenses will be those armored cars," he warned the Petrograd Soviets on December 2nd. "Remember this," he concluded. "Every day of drunkenness brings the other side closer to victory, and us to the old slavery." In desperation, Lenin's government gave a special military commissar of Petrograd for combating drunkenness and pogroms the authority to shoot looters on the spot. Because experience has shown that less decisive measures have had not the desired result, the regiment designed to restore order and Villisky Island announced a special proclamation. "Storehouses of alcoholic beverages will be blown up with dynamite. No advanced warning will be given before the explosions." The orgy of intoxication, robbery, confiscation, expropriation, and the murder that filled the last days of 1917 left no doubt among Petrograd's former well-to-do that the old days would never return so long as the Bolsheviks ruled Russia. But the flood of decrees curated to make life wretched for the men and women who had stood at the pinnacle of the old order and did nothing to relieve the misery of the proletarians whose interests the new government now claimed to serve. As shipments of grain, coal, wood, and raw materials grew more erratic, shops and factories closed their doors and left tens of thousands of the city's proletarians without food and work. Starving Petrograd, the city without coal or bread, with its factories nearly gone. Alexei Tolstoy wrote in 1918, Russia's capital, he remembered, was a terrible place at the end of 1917. To men and women whose labor counted for little, the passage of hours and days had little meaning, and for centuries had moved according to their own sense of time. Time was of so little value in Russia, one caustic observer explained, that nobody had even bothered to learn how to save it. In 1917, this meant that although Russia's revolutionary upheavals produced shortages of everything else, they created a surplus of waiting. Every day brought longer lines in which people with shorter tempers waited more hours for less food and fewer goods. Petrograders stood in line for bread, meat, sugar, kerosene, cloth, tobacco, chocolate, and theater tickets. People even stood in line that winter to receive tickets that allowed them to come back to stand in line another day to buy such scarce items as shoes, boots, and galoshes. Because tradition dictated that mothers with infants be served first, Petrograd's women began to rent infants so they could get to the head of the line more quickly. Men and women, with nothing left to sell but their time, began to post signs offering themselves for queue work only, as they struggled to turn the hours spent in lines to some account. The search for food became all-consuming, even in the drawing rooms. De Robin wrote, people can only talk of the best way to get a hold of a sack of flour or a few eggs. Vicious winter storms, combined with food and fuel shortages to add to Petrograders' misery that winter. 4 blizzards struck the city during the last 10 days of December and piled mountains of snow upon streets and tram lines. As swirling and drifting snow in other parts of Russia slowed rail shipments of wood and coal, fuel became scarce in Petrograd, as the snow was now plentiful. Coal and firewood could be obtained only at the price of heroic effort, one of the Bolsheviks remembered many years later. As the midwinter nights lengthened beyond 18 hours, dwindling fuel supplies produced an acute shortage of electricity that plunged Petrograd's buildings into darkness for all but 2 or 3 hours each day, and extinguished its street lamps for weeks on end. When anxious men and women hurried to replace electric lights with lamps, they found they could buy no more than a paltry ounce and 3/4 of kerosene each day. Despite bitter rumors that Russia's new leaders lived in luxury while the masses froze and starved, the men who grappled with these crises suffered along with the rest. We froze, one old Bolshevik remembered. Our leaders froze in their offices. Even Lenin froze. In a nation where the masses' diet consisted mainly of bread, Petrograd's bakers had to knead and bake 725 tons of flour into bread every day to feed the city's 2.25 million people. Because the trains that had made their way to the capital along Russia's crumbling railways during the fall of 1917 had carried less than a third of that amount, Petrograders' daily bread ration fell to a mere half-pound, supplemented by trifling quantities of meat, sugar, fats, and 1 egg every 16 days. Although experts estimated that the labor required an absolute minimum of 3,000 calories to survive, the daily rations were nearly half of that. During the first 3 months of 1918, good-starved Western Siberian peasants exchanged over 250,000 tons of grain reserves for more than 60 million rubles worth of manufactured goods. But without enough trains to move grain from the countryside to our cities, Russia's food crisis worsened. When the Bolsheviks moved their capital to Moscow in February, the city's daily bread ration had fallen below a quarter pound, and the workers' entire daily ration produced a pitiful 306 calories. To add to the Bolsheviks' difficulties, Russia's hard-drinking peasants continued to distill hundreds of thousands of tons of precious grain into vodka. Thirsty country folk and one large Siberian province distilled an estimated 250,000 tons of grain during the winter of 1917 to 18. And the authorities discovered one village in central Russia where peasants had distilled enough grain that winter to have fed a town of 10,000 people. Not yet able to extend their authority into each of Russia's hundreds of thousands of tiny peasant villages, the Bolsheviks could only lament the loss of such desperately needed food supplies and appeal to those poor citizens whose hunger had begun to rival that of their city brethren to take matters into their own hands. Whole cities, entire provinces are starving, one Bolshevik propagandist wrote. Join together, all you poor folk, in town and country, all you workers in field and factory. Remember, Russia's entire future, the fate of all her toilers, lies in your hands alone. You overthrow the Tsar. You dump that petty Tsarlet. Did you do all this so that you could be defeated now by Tsar hunger? Clearly, the Bolsheviks hoped that Russia's poorest peasants would take their side against those who still had surplus grain. But the response of the Russian countryside proved to be far more complex than they had hoped. The persistence of the Samogan trade in the time of famine stemmed in part from the most productive peasants' hatred for the government's wartime price-fixing policies, and their hunger for hard to come by farm implements and tools. While the Bolsheviks fought their battle against kulak distillers, the food shortages that plagued the towns and cities of central Russia during the fall of 1917 therefore began to spread to hundreds of thousands of poor peasant households. Even in normal times, the last days of winter brought hunger to Russia's countryside. For only one peasant family in 9 or 10 usually had enough to last from harvest to harvest. The first months of 1918 saw such shortages become unusually severe, and poor peasants in the provinces around Petrograd, Psycho, and Novograd began to eat bark, straw, and moss long before the spring thaw. At about the same time, peasants in the nearby province began to mix their last precious stores of coarse flour with corn husks, chaff, hay, and nettles. A few years later, one of them still remembered how luxurious bread baked from a mixture of potato pits, oat stifflings, vegetable husks, and a bit of rye flour that seemed, during those hungry times, as hungry crowds pleaded for food, violence flared. An angry mob in Taldum killed the local food commissar and stuffed his mouth full of ration cards. In Rybinsk and Pulaski Posad, hungry peasants burned the headquarters of the local Soviet and beat several of its members to death. 50 Red Guards had to be rushed from Moscow to disperse a mob in Ziebengrad that threatened to take matters into its own hands after it had swelled to nearly 10,000. Always, hunger drove the masses on, and the promise of food dampened their outrage, just as surely as useless ration cards stirred it. Not far from Petrograd, in the village of Klopno, the authorities dispersed a starving mob. with a promise to increase the bread ration to a paltry £1/4 a day. Such promises could not stave off death by hunger as famine began to take its deadly toll on Russia's towns and villages. By the thousands, and then by the tens of thousands, Russians began to bury their dead as the spring thaw came. To make matters worse, the Bolsheviks' enemies seized the very areas from which Lenin's hungry followers had hoped to draw more grain during the lean spring and early summer months. That spring, German armies occupied the north shore of the Black Sea and the Ukraine, easily the most productive of all the grain fields in Russia, and the breadbasket, not only of the former Russian Empire, but much of Eastern and Central Europe. On the heels of that loss, victorious whites seized Siberia, the Transvolga region, and the rich lands that lay along the lower reaches of the Kuban and Don rivers. Before the hungry spring of 1918 had moved into midsummer, more than 8 out of every 10 bushels of the grain that Russia's peasants had stored after the harvest of 1917 lay beyond the Bolsheviks' reach. If there had been too little food in March, there was much less by June. Soaring unemployment made the plight of Russia's hungry proletarians more desperate still, and Petrograd alone, 40 large factories that had employed nearly 80,000 mill hands at the time of the October Revolution, closed their doors before spring. Out of more than 5,000 workers at the Franco-Ruski factory, only a handful remained as caretakers, and even the gigantic works were laid off at least 2/3 of their workforce. Within 4 months after the October Revolution, the number of Petrograd's unemployed factory workers increased by more than 100,000. Then, shortages of coal, electricity, and raw materials drove that number even higher. Before fall came in 1918, Petrograd's factories employed less than 1/3 of the men and women who had worked there the year before. Ironically, unemployment struck hardest at the Militasti, those elite skilled metal workers who had been among the most active supporters of Russia's revolutionary movement since the 1880s and had formed the core of the Bolshevik strength. Metallisti lost so many jobs during the Bolsheviks' first year in power that less than 50,000 out of a wartime contingent of nearly 250,000 remained in Petrograd at the end of 1918. Some have been killed in the struggles for freedom, Petrograd's Metal Workers Union reported as it looked back on the Bolsheviks' first year in power. Others have gone off to fight. A third group left at the time of the evacuation, and the fourth group has been scattered all across the country in search of food for themselves and their families. So vast was the flight from Petrograd during the Civil War that 7 out of every 10 men and women who lived there in 1917 no longer remained there in the summer of 1920. Russia's factory workers thus turned their backs upon those urban centers that had been their beacons of hope ever since the emancipation of 1861. There they found traditional points of reference, slipping away almost as rapidly as in the cities of their peasant relatives. On the evening of the Bolsheviks' revolutionary triumph, Lenin had proclaimed that private ownership of land shall be abolished forever, and had promised that the right to use the land shall be accorded to all the citizens of Russia. Yet, he had purposefully left vague in his explanations how those principles might be put to practice. During the first months of 1918, Russia's peasants therefore moved to shape Lenin's promises to accord with their own understanding. Almost everywhere, peasants had looted livestock, farm implements, and valuables from local manor houses in response to Lenin's decree on land. Yet, despite the sense of violence that emerges from memoirs and newspaper reports of that time, the number of such outbreaks remained small compared to the great number of landlords who were dispossessed. The peasants' natural caution, common sense, and sense of fair play inevitably overbalanced their first impulse to give vent to centuries of accumulated anger. and instances in which they helped former landlords to find a place in which the new order could seem nearly as numerous as the incidents in which they looted their estates. Far more frequently, hungry peasants directed their anger against local officials who met their pleas for bread with more regulations and more useless ration cards. During the hungry spring of 1918, nothing spoke more dramatically of the hunger in town and country than reports that poured into the People's Commissariat for Food Supply. None could doubt Russian masses' desperation as telegram after telegram chronicled their daily confrontations with hunger and death. We have no more bread. The situation is hopeless. Hunger reigns. The food situation in Kishma has taken an ominous turn that is leading to a catastrophe. Individual rations for April and May have been equal to only 2 pounds of flour for an entire month. Yaroslav province is in absolutely unprecedentedly impoverished and catastrophic conditions so far food supplies are concerned. Absolutely no shipments of grain have arrived for 2 weeks. Starving workers are collapsing at their machines. Everyone who is able continues to work and will continue to do so. We beg you to send us bread. This is not a threat, but the final cry of despair.